In 2001, a company that Fortune magazine had named America's most innovative company for 6 consecutive years went from being worth $65 billion to zero in less than 12 months. Thousands of people lost their entire retirement savings. And the way it happened wasn't a bank run or a market crash. It was done with accounting entries, wires and paper dots on a spreadsheet. Welcome to Crime Decoded. I'm Mark.
And I'm Dr. Sophie. Mark, where does this case begin?
It begins in Houston, Texas, in 1985. A company called Internorth, a natural gas pipeline operator, merges with another pipeline company called Houston Natural Gas. The new entity is named Enron. At this point, it's a perfectly ordinary energy company. Pipelines, gas contracts, nothing glamorous.
And that ordinariness is important because the story of Enron isn't really about the company that was created. It's about the company it became and the culture that fueled that transformation.
Exactly. In 1990, Enron hires a man named Jeffrey Skilling. Skilling graduates from Harvard Business School with an MBA, and he brings with him a philosophy that would ultimately destroy the company. He believed in what he called asset-light strategy, the idea that Enron shouldn't own physical assets like pipelines. Instead, it should trade energy contracts the way Wall Street trades stocks.
So the company shifts from being a utility to being a trading floor. And this is a critical point psychologically. Skilling creates what organizational psychologists call a winner-take-all culture. Everyone at Enron is ranked every 6 months. The bottom 15% are fired. The top performers receive enormous bonuses. The message is clear: produce or be removed.
And here's the detail that changes everything. In a normal company, if you want to report a profit, you have to actually deliver a product or service and receive payment. That's basic accounting. But Skilling's innovation was to apply a rule called mark-to-market accounting to energy contracts.
I want to pause on that term, Mark, because it's central to understanding this crime. Mark-to-market accounting is a legitimate method used by financial institutions. It means you value an asset at its current market price, not at what you paid for it. If you own a bond worth $100 today, you report it as $100, even if you bought it for $90.
And that works fine for assets that have an actual market price. But Enron applied it to long-term energy contracts, deals that might take 10 or 15 years to complete. Under mark-to-market, Enron could sign a contract today and book the entire projected profit from that contract as current income. Right now, this year, even if nothing had been delivered yet.
And from a psychological standpoint, that's the moment the crime becomes possible. Because now you aren't reporting what actually happened. You're reporting what you predict will happen, and predictions can be manipulated.
Let me give you a concrete example. In 1992, Enron signed a 20-year contract to supply natural gas to a power plant in India called Dabhol. The project was massive, but here's the problem. The Dabhol plant wasn't built yet. The infrastructure didn't exist. The Indian government was still negotiating terms. Yet Enron booked millions of dollars in profit from that contract the same year it was signed.
And listeners might be thinking, surely the auditors caught this? The Securities and Exchange Commission was supposed to oversee this. That's where the next layer of the crime comes in, because it wasn't just one accounting method, it was a system. Let's talk about the partnerships.
Right. In the late 1990s, Enron's chief financial officer, a man named Andrew Fastow, created what are called special purpose entities, or SPEs. These are legally separate companies that a corporation can create for a specific purpose, usually to manage risk or finance a project. In theory, they're legitimate. In practice, Fastow used them to hide billions of dollars in debt.
Here's where I want listeners to understand the psychology of what's happening at this point. By 1999, Enron's executives know they have a problem. The company has been reporting enormous profits based on mark-to-market accounting, but those profits aren't real cash, they're projections. And when you book a future profit as current income, eventually the future arrives, and you have to deliver. If you can't, the whole facade collapses. So the executives need a way to keep the appearance of profitability alive while hiding the accumulating debt from those failed projections.
So Fasto creates these SPEs with names like Chuco, LJM1, LJM2, and the purpose is simple. Enron transfers its bad assets to these entities. Bad investments, failing projects, debt, it all gets moved off Enron's books. But here's the crucial detail. These entities are supposed to be independent. They're supposed to be funded by outside investors. Fasto was the CFO of Enron. He could not legally also be the manager of these entities, but he was, and he made millions doing it.
What's fascinating from a forensic psychology perspective is how quickly the ethical boundary shifts. In the beginning, someone might say, "This is just aggressive accounting. We're maximizing shareholder value." But by the time Fasto was creating these entities designed specifically to deceive investors and regulators, that rationalization has become something else entirely. It's what we call moral disengagement. The executives have convinced themselves that the rules don't apply because the ends justify the means.
And the ends, in this case, were astonishing. Enron's stock price rose from about $20 per share in 1995 to over $90 per share in August of 2000. The company was reporting revenues that rivaled the largest corporations in the world. In 2000, Enron reported revenues of over $100 billion. That made it the seventh largest company in America by revenue.
But here's the number that should have made everyone stop. That $100 billion in revenue, it produced a net income of only about $1 billion. In other words, for every $100 Enron took in, it kept less than $1 as profit. A healthy company in that sector would have a profit margin of 5 to 10%. Enron's was under 1%.
Now, why did sophisticated investors, including Wall Street analysts who were paid to understand this stuff, fail to notice? Because Enron was reporting growth. The stock was going up. And when a stock is going up, there's enormous psychological pressure not to ask difficult questions.
That's literally the concept of information cascades in behavioral economics. When everyone around you is buying Enron stock, when every analyst says buy, when the CEO is on the cover of every business magazine, the human brain interprets that consensus as evidence. Most people assume that if thousands of smart people all believe the same thing, the thing must be true. The irony is that the smartest people at Enron's auditor, Arthur Andersen, were the ones whose judgment should have stopped this, and they didn't.
And now we get to Arthur Andersen's role. Andersen was one of the big five accounting firms, the most prestigious auditing companies in the world. They were paid $52 million in fees by Enron in the year 2000 alone. But here's the problem. Andersen wasn't just Enron's auditor. They were also Enron's consultant. Andersen was advising Enron on tax strategy, on risk management, on business structure. The auditor who was supposed to check the books was also helping to cook them.
This is called a conflict of interest, and it's not unique to Enron. It's a systemic vulnerability. When an auditor is paid significantly more for consulting than for auditing, there's an inherent incentive to approve aggressive accounting treatments. If you say no, you lose the consulting contract. So you say yes, and you keep saying yes until the bubble bursts.
And inside Enron, there were whistleblowers. In August 2001, a vice president named Sharon Watkins sent an anonymous letter to Ken Lay, Enron's chairman and CEO, warning him that the company was about to implode. She wrote, "I am incredibly nervous that we will implode in a wave of accounting scandals." Ken Lay ignored the letter. He continued to tell employees and investors that everything was fine.
That's another critical psychological insight. Ken Lay was not a technical financial mind. He was a charismatic leader. And charismatic leaders often create what we call cognitive blind spots in their followers. The followers believe so deeply in the leader's vision that they dismiss contradictory evidence. Lay could stand up at a company-wide meeting in September 2001, just 2 months before the collapse, and say, "Our stock is the best investment you can make." And employees believed him. They bought more stock. They doubled down.
And those employees lost everything. Enron had a 401 Hoosier retirement plan, a tax-advantaged savings account where employees could invest their own money. About 62% of the plan's assets were invested in Enron stock. The company matched employee contributions with Enron stock, and the employees were forbidden from selling that stock until they reached age 50, even as Enron's stock price was collapsing.
Let me pause and make this concrete. An Enron employee named Charles Prestwood had $700,000 in his 401 Hoosier Conchit. All of it was Enron stock. When the company collapsed, he was left with almost nothing. He had to go back to work as a security guard at age 66. That's not an abstract number, that's a person.
And the collapse itself happened with breathtaking speed. In October 2001, Enron announced a $1.2 billion reduction in shareholder equity. That's accounting language for we lost a huge amount of money we told you we had. The stock dropped from $33 to zero in roughly 6 weeks. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It was the largest bankruptcy in American history at that point.
And then the dominoes fell. Arthur Andersen, the auditing firm, was indicted for obstruction of justice. They had shredded thousands of Enron-related documents after the SEC investigation began. The firm essentially collapsed. 26,000 people lost their jobs at Andersen alone.
As for the executives, Ken Lay was convicted on 10 counts of securities fraud and conspiracy in 2006. He died of a heart attack before sentencing. Jeffrey Skilling was convicted on 19 counts, including insider trading and fraud. He served 12 years of a 24-year sentence. Andrew Vastow pleaded guilty to 2 counts of securities fraud and served about 5 years.
And those sentences, did they feel like justice to you? From an investigator's perspective?
Here's the thing about white-collar crime. When someone holds up a bank with a gun, they get 20 years. When someone destroys $65 billion of value and destroys tens of thousands of lives, they get a fraction of that. The justice system is built for street crime, not for corporate crime. And that's a systemic failure we haven't addressed.
So let's bring this together for our listeners. What are the specific red flags from this case that anyone can recognize, whether you're an investor, an employee, or someone who just reads the news?
First, when a company's profits come from valuation, not from cash, if you look at an income statement and you see a line item that says mark-to-market gains or fair value adjustments, that's profit that hasn't been realized in cash yet. A healthy company can explain exactly where its cash comes from.
Second, when insiders are selling stock while telling the public to buy. At Enron, executives sold over $1 billion in stock in the 2 years before the collapse. At the same time, they were telling employees to keep investing. That's an asymmetric information signal. If the people who run the company are selling, you should ask why.
Third, complicated financial structures that defy simple explanation. If a company's CFO can't explain its business model in 3 sentences, that's a warning. Enron's financial statements were thousands of pages long. Even experienced analysts couldn't understand them.
And fourth, and this is the one I want listeners to remember, the culture of a company matters more than its numbers. A company where people are afraid to ask questions is a company where fraud can hide. The exit of honest people is often the earliest warning sign.
And that's what broke Enron. Investigators from the SEC and the Department of Justice eventually found the truth because a few people, like Sharon Watkins, were willing to write down what they saw. The system finally worked, but only after $65 billion had already disappeared.
And from a psychological standpoint, Mark, what stays with me is this. The Enron executives were not evil in a cartoon sense. They were people who made a series of small ethical compromises that became larger and larger until they were trapped. The most important barrier to this kind of crime is not better regulation, though that helps. It's a culture where honest questions are welcomed, not punished.
That's the lesson I want our listeners to take from this episode. Criminals in suits are still criminals. The victims are real, and the red flags are there if you know what to look for.
Want to understand more about how criminals think? Hit subscribe. New episodes of Crime Decoded drop every day.